Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for tuning in to the webinar this evening. And this evening's webinar is with special guest Martin Robinson. We're going to be discussing his book on the curriculum, Athena versus the Machine. And I'll be playing Athena. Martin will be the machine this evening. And Martin, welcome. How are you?
I think I'm well, thank you. And you're looking well too.
You look very well. You look very well. And I happen to know Martin actually was an early Corona adopter, weren't you?
Yes. I decided to find out all about it from the inside.
And yeah, but recovered, and I have to say, looking very svelte and well in recovery.
It did me good.
Yeah. And so I should say, I've got some questions I'm going to be asking Martin in just a moment. If you have questions for Martin, or God bless you, if you have questions for me, do please type them in the Q&A box at the in your Zoom interface, and we'll get to your questions after we've had a bit of a chat and a bit of a chew, and hopefully the questions that we ask will provoke you into your own explorations around the curriculum. So, Martin, are you up and raring to go?
I'm up.
Okay, well, so obviously you've written this book about the curriculum, and you have these two polarized positions, Athena and the machine, and they're metaphors, aren't they? They're analogies, and so the machine is used to characterize a particular view of education. Can you explain a little bit about what you mean by the machine?
Well, the machine covers a variety of ways of seeing education, I suppose. But a lot of it is the idea of input-output, that things go in and things come out, whether that is exam results or learning or whatever it happens to be, it goes in and comes out. So the machine is, you can see it through management systems, the idea perhaps that using data to track every inch of a child's progress and see how they're doing. The idea of brain as computer, that you put things into the brain, just into memory, that's all you need, and that's a good education, which, these are sort of metaphors that perhaps can get people carried away with certain views of education. Taylorist approaches, the ideas of time and motion state, I suppose, but the idea that the teacher knows less and the manager knows more, and therefore micromanagement has to come into play. And also the way that science can be used, which I think verges on scientism, and so getting that right, if you like. So it's perhaps certain subjects work better for data than others. So something like drama, for instance, I remember being asked every 2 weeks to put a percentage down of how a child was doing in drama. So I had to say, well, this, the child has got 23% in mime, but now has got 43% in mime. So that's a 20% increase in mime. And it's just, it doesn't help, certain things like that. So perhaps
it's a shame that you have to say that and not act it out in silence.
Let me out of this box. Something like that. So yeah, so it's one way of seeing education as mainly summed up in numbers, I suppose.
Okay, is that and that's what you mean by scientism?
Scientism is trying to toe that line when science becomes something when it really isn't science, or becomes something as a way of seeing the world which doesn't necessarily make sense. So some examples I used in the book are of that, but also examples of trying to justify certain subjects place on the curriculum by using science. So the arts, and I do come to things from an arts perspective, so the arts get this a lot. That the reason that you would do something like drama or music is because it will make you better at maths or communication, and therefore make you more employable, when there's no necessary need for that whatsoever. But it also demeans the entire subject, as though, it has no worth of itself. The fact you can do music for its own sake perhaps hasn't been thought about, or perhaps you could even do maths to get better at music hasn't been thought about. So that's what that's what I call a bit. That's another part of scientism, where science is going into places where it really isn't needed necessarily.
Okay. So in this conception, then, ideally, what would you be arguing that a school is for?
Well, a school is for, well, I use Athena as the
Mm,
idea. So a school is for trying to educate a child in the pursuit of wisdom. I've got actually something about that. So hang on, here we go. Yeah, here's an interesting quote. So if we look at the idea of how we see the world and trying to make our way in the world, we want to give a certain direction towards that, which is towards wisdom.
yeah.
You're never going to achieve being a wisest person in the world or the wisest person ever, but it gives a direction to something. So again, the machine way of seeing it is to try, well, our direction is exam results and league tables and accountability and all those things. For an Athena pursuit, if you like, is the pursuit of wisdom, saying you might not ever get there, you probably won't get there, but it gives a direction to all the things you study. And therefore we say, well, what is that wisdom for? Well, it's for someone to get meaning in the world, to understand various things about the world, to get different perspectives upon the world, to think. And some of this might be indeed about getting good grades and getting worthwhile employment out of it. But the absolute focus of it is not necessarily the number at the end of it. Because if your focus is the number at the end of it, I don't think you actually get an education worthy of that number, if you like.
Right. Okay. So what you're saying is that it's not that you're against children having good grades or schools working hard for children to do well academically. It's just that if that's our focus, then are we less likely to achieve the ends that we want? If we're more focused on trying to make children wiser, then the grades will come with that.
Yeah, it's a paradox if you just go for the grades, and you might even get good grades at the end of it, but it doesn't mean you've actually pursued an education worthy of the grade itself. So let's say you've got a student who's got eights and nines or whatever it is at the end of their education, but doesn't understand much about the world that they're in, has a very narrow education. I'll give an example of a school that followed something I call the Frankenstein Curriculum, where they could choose in those days Frankenstein for A level. So it was an A level text. They also chose it for GCSE. So it was a GCSE text. And of course, the kids were doing very well at A level because they studied it at GCSE. But on top of that, for Key Stage 3, they also studied Frankenstein. So, that
Mm.
really prepared them for GCSE. Now, the kids got very good grades for their Frankenstein studies. But did they get a good education, and was it a wise thing to do? Well, I would say no. It's not a good education. No, it wasn't a wise thing to do. Would it make them more capable of reading, of understanding literature, the breadth of literature, having different perspectives, understanding how different things work in different genres? No. So it's not a wise approach, but it got them good grades. So
Mm.
what to say?
So it just occurs to me that the approach that you're advocating, this focus on wisdom, might actually be well supported by the fairly recent change in direction by Ofsted, for instance, who have said we're less interested in these outcomes and more interested in the quality of education that a school is endeavouring to provide for its students. Is that do you feel that you're fellow travellers with the current
I, I
inspection regime?
I like to think so on that, certainly. You've mentioned a very important word, and part of what we're saying about the machine and Athena. One other difference perhaps is quantity versus quality, and you mentioned
Mm,
quality there. And as soon as you start talking about quality, you're in a very interesting but difficult place, because quality involves a judgment, which is personal, which is subjective. And Ofsted go in, of course, having to make more of an objective judgment about subjective things. So I think there is an interesting tension there, certainly,
right.
that I think professionals should discuss. But when it comes down to can you put it down in one of four grades, I think it becomes more difficult.
Of
So
course.
I would be wary about that. But
No.
certainly the conversation, are we having a good education? What's the quality like here? Is it good? Then those things become very important. So on that way of judging it, yes, I would be a fellow
Okay,
traveller.
but we can agree then, or at least you've argued that studying Frankenstein 3 times during the course of your secondary school education is objectively bad.
Um, if you just judge it on the grade at the end of it, so if you are a senior manager looking at the English department grades and the progress of the child, remember this is a few years ago where this sort of thing was de rigueur. Now it's thanks to people like Ofsted and people asking the question. Yeah, objectively, if you look at it, well, is it bad? Objectively, if you just measure it with the grade at the end of it. If you then say, objectively, have they had a wide or a broad experience of curriculum, then objectively, no. So you have to ask the
Right.
question slightly differently.
Okay, that's a good point. So, one of the other things that you, I think, are critical of, and reframe in sort of perhaps interesting ways, is the idea that schools should be in the business of social mobility. Do you want to say a little bit about the problems with that as a concept, and what maybe we should be thinking about instead?
Right. Well, the way I try and explain what we should have instead is cultural mobility, but
Yeah.
perhaps we'll come to that later. Social mobility seems to me problematic in various ways. What's your outcome for social mobility? Well, if it's everyone going to university and then everyone having a white collar job to show that they have moved on, well, then society is going to be in a very strange place in its functioning, because it's not going to have people doing various jobs that certain people perhaps look down upon in some ways. So the public services, the people who collect your refuse from the front drive or wherever it is, or the front of your house. There are various jobs that people might look down on if we're going to be socially mobile. Oh, you'll end up as a shelf stacker in Tesco's, if you don't sort of fuck your ideas up. Well, we still need shelf stackers in Tesco's. The last time I looked. The other thing is we've got a situation where, because of the amount in this country of people going through university, there aren't the graduate jobs out there for them. So the expectation of going to university and getting a good job is finding itself in a very difficult situation. And I think over the next few years, due to things like COVID or whatever, there might be a hell of a recession out there. And what are the jobs that are going to be able to be picked up? It's going to be interesting to see what happens with that as well. So there is one problem with social mobility, is there aren't the jobs there. The second point is a complete moral one. Are we all going to allow everyone to do just the great jobs out there and wait for robots to sweep the streets and do the thing, all these other things that are there? So that doesn't work. There is also the fact that, and this is quite crucial, that it's education as a motor for social mobility is what people argue for, by the way. I'm not talking about mobility generally.
Yeah.
But if we look at social mobility through education, there is no evidence that it's ever actually happened, that social mobility has happened because of education. There are perhaps individual instances that you can pick up. But generally, social mobility tends to be through large changes in the economy, technology, and various things happening around that way. So one thing that people point to a lot about education causing social mobility is grammar schools in the 1930s and 40s, saying, well, we had grammar schools and we had huge social mobility then. Well, we did have huge social mobility then, by the way. But most of that was due to new technologies and a new way of working in this country, which was reducing the number of people working in factories and increasing shops, increasing the white collar working, and new industries, or increasingly larger industries, should we say, in mainly mass entertainment. There was TV, newspapers, rock and roll bands, getting involved in making an LP or something, or driving a Lambretta, this huge things around popular culture, cars, and millions of people working, making various things, but also doing all the technical work that comes with that. So being engineers and having to be in the offices and doing all that. So that was at the same time as grammar schools, but grammar schools didn't drive that. But people look at that and then say, oh, there's evidence that grammar schools drove, an increase of people getting better jobs, but it didn't happen. But the working class, male population working class in 1951 was about 55%. Yeah, something like that. By 2011, it was 30% of people working in the working class, and the professional classes moved from 11% to 40% over that period of time. So it's a big shift. That wasn't down to education. That's down to changes in society that we were then told retrospectively were down to grammar school, all these other things.
And I suppose it's it feels plausible that that education is causal in this kind of equation, and it certainly fits with people's lived experiences. Had they gone to grammar school, obviously they had personally very different experiences to the ones they would have had they gone to a secondary modern school, and so all of this contributes to perhaps a confusing correlation with causation. That these changes happened at the same time as I went to grammar school, and therefore my personal experience is representative of what happened.
Yeah, and those personal experiences are very important. People had perhaps for the first time in their family. I mean, just see the difference between my mum and dad, which is a few years difference between them. But my dad left school at 14. My mum left school at 18. She went to a grammar school. He went to an ordinary school, and the difference between the two is huge in terms of their reading and that they had at that time. Afterwards, my dad did a lot more reading, but there's certainly different, within every story there are personal responses to a very good education that a lot of people had, and that is very important.
Okay, and I think one of the other criticisms that sometimes people make about the concept of social mobility is there's something about middle class educators looking down on the background of students and saying, well, of course, we want to change your life chances. We want to give you the opportunity to leave your wretched origins and aspire to be more like me. And there's something a little bit squeamish, a little bit unpleasant about that as a sort of narrative that might underpin the working schools. Is that something?
Yeah, absolutely. The idea that if you live in a certain place and like certain things and read certain things and listen to certain things, that you're a lesser person because of it. This also comes down to whose knowledge and what's the right knowledge we should have and all those things as well, and the Arnoldian idea of the best that's been thought and said and opening up sweetness and light and making you a better person perhaps because of it. And those things can get very squeamish about it. If you are saying that this way of existing is not very good or is not as good as, then you're encouraging people to sort of put on the borrowed clothes of a certain way of looking about the world, so it becomes sort of Henry Higgins and taking on, the working class and making the middle class, which is not what a good education should be about at all. You need to try and wrest it from the idea of class structures and saying that this is middle class knowledge, that is working class knowledge, and there the twain shall meet,
Although maybe the direction of travel isn't always as clear cut as that. For instance, that what might have been considered football, for instance, might have been considered a working class pursuit in the past, and now it's much more mainstream, much more middle class, perhaps, in the way that industry works.
It's with cultural capital that if you cultural capital when Bourdieu was writing, or perhaps before then, or in certain societies, might have been about going to the opera. Now it might be having a box at Old Trafford, watching Man United play, something like that, or Liverpool perhaps, or whatever. So there are certainly different ways of saying that this is a value at a certain time, and that shows culture changes. Culture is not a static thing; it does move. So if you're talking about what is cultural capital, then that is a problematic thing. Also,
Right.
the individual, I think, has a role in this as well. The thing is about you must do this and like this and do this in order to move on. But a lot of what moves people on is, if you like, being in the right place at the right time as well. It's Ringo in the Beatles. Where would Ringo be if it wasn't for being in Liverpool at that time with those other people around him, with that sound going on, with Brian Epstein being there? Where would Cilla Black be, if she hadn't been at that club working in the door there, and all those things? It's about culture moves around you and you move as part of it. It's not a one-way thing into you that you've got to work hard and get yourself on. It's also about being in the right place, right? And you look through history, whether it be Athens or wherever it happens to be, at certain periods of time,
Yeah.
the place is a very important part of how you move in the world.
A question's come in actually as we've been speaking from Angelita, who's asking, or posing the question: haven't many immigrant populations achieved social mobility through education?
Right. So again, there's a lot of evidence about this, and discussion about this, and I don't want to go into too much detail because I haven't got the evidence in front of me. But some of the evidence is that a lot of immigrant population, not all immigrant populations, so we're talking about different immigrant populations over periods of time, but let's say the London Challenge. A lot
Mm,
of what people said moved the London Challenge forward is various things they brought in and the way schools working together and all these things. But there's another bit of evidence saying, well, what also happened over this period of time was a very large increase of immigration into London. And a lot of that immigration was class wise, middle class. And
yeah.
and also the people who came also were people saying, right, I want to get on, and full of, a certain amount of chutzpah to put themselves, move from one culture to another culture, to set up and work all the hours that God sent, and very much a working environment for a child to be brought up in. But like I say, it's not all immigrant populations are the
No,
same,
no.
and it's about what they bring. But a lot of the time, yes, very much so. But that again is that about the education they've had, or their attitude towards the education they are having? And I think
Yeah.
that again is the correlation causation thing to look
Right.
at. But I
Yeah.
haven't got all the details about that.
No, and it's a good point to make that especially with first, second generation immigration, that the sorts of people
Oh,
who have the wherewithal to leave where they are, to travel, to arrive somewhere new, to start a new life, the likelihood is that the sort of people who are well equipped to do that are also well equipped to do well in the education system.
yeah,
Um,
maybe. But again, if we look at overall figures, then of course you go down to every single individual who's involved in that, and there'll be different stories going on.
of course, yeah. So we're making generalizations,
Yeah.
absolutely. Okay, you mentioned that maybe we should replace the concept of social mobility with cultural mobility. Can you tell us a little bit about the distinction?
Right. So cultural mobility to me. So if you think of culture as a way of being in the world, if you like. So what is culture? Culture is the thing that humans make and makes them, and each way of seeing the world is slightly different. So let's just put it in the terms of, when I go to a football match, I'm looking at the world in a different way than when I'm going to a concert of I don't know, some Mozart or something like that. Let's say I'm in different ways of seeing the world, different ways of being in the world in those two instances. I'm the same person, but I'm seeing things slightly differently. And again, if I'm then looking at a science paper or something like that, or looking at dissection or whatever it happens to be, or looking at the stars, through a telescope, again, I'll be looking at things and getting different things from the world. So cultural mobility is the idea of being mobile through these different cultures, ways of seeing the world, whether it be music, fashion, cars, subjects. The subjects at school give us a very, why have a wide number of subjects? Why have a range of subjects to do? Well, they give us different ways of seeing. So cultural mobility is being able to move between them, I'd say seamlessly, but not seeing, but seeing the differences between them, that there are actually important differences between these different ways of seeing the world. So it's opposed to, if you like, the idea of where everything becomes one subject, that project-based learning sometimes looks at that way, collapsing the differences between subjects and saying, well, actually, the differences between subjects are very important. They're different ways of seeing the world, and cultural mobility is about being able to do the jumps across them, if you like. That's not saying that you should never collapse those borders between them. You should be able to see over those borders and perhaps make interesting connections across them as well. But that's a different thing than completely collapsing all borders.
So maybe we could summarize the difference as saying that perhaps social mobility is about leaving something behind and taking on something new, whereas cultural mobility is more about choice and
Choice, but also valuing different experiences, and that, and you're very right there, because it's something else I talk about in the book with social mobility. This idea of some utopian future or utilitarian future that's out there for you. All you have to do is this, and that will happen, and therefore it'll be a better world. You'll be a better person. You'll be happier. Your character will improve. All those things I think are rather dubious, and
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the I think maybe for some people quite surprising and interesting critiques that you make in the book is you're discussing quite a bit of detail the idea of the knowledge-rich curriculum, and that certain iterations of that might be in conflict with your idea of educating for wisdom. Do you want to help us understand that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the way of describing this is saying, first of all, I believe that it should be a knowledge-rich curriculum. That's it. So I could stop there.
Right. Okay. Moving on.
Yeah. The problem I have with it is then, and these are encapsulated in questions which people move towards when they're saying things like, well, whose knowledge, who decides, what knowledge, and all that. What the crucial point to me is that knowledge isn't neutrally known. So I give an example when I do talks on this about tea. So I put up pictures of different colors of tea, so in the cup. So some are very milky and white, very down to no milk at all and all that. And ask people which is the best cup of tea. Now, if you're just saying this is the best novel, it's Frankenstein and blah, 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 whatever it is, this is the thing you're going to know, that this is the knowledge rich, then what's missing is how that knowledge is seen by the person learning about it and saying, well, that's not rich to me. I don't find that as rich as you do, or something like that. And what I'm trying to get across there is that in the first instance, there's prejudice. Absolutely, I hate that. I love that. That's it. And what you're trying to do is actually educate people to make judgment about things, which is an educated judgment. So you're working on, and this is certainly the case in arts, in politics, in lots of other things. You're trying to work on people's values to make them think about things, not all think the same, but to come up with judgments which are educated judgments, which are tasteful, whatever that means, and try and get involved in the conversation where equally valued ideas come through. And this takes a range of perspectives to come up with things. So you need to taste all the different types of tea, but you also need to educate your palate to understand the different types of tea. So I've got a quote here from a wine critic to give you some ideas, and Michael Schuster. The capacity of our senses to perceive far exceeds our ability to articulate all the sensations we can experience. And of course, we do not need the words to have the experience. But once acquired and linked to the appropriate sensations, words help us locate and identify them subsequently. And when we taste with a wide vocabulary, an active search of the mind generates the words, which in turn capture and crystallize the sensations. So in other words, we want to have a wide enough education there to enable people to put the things they are reaching towards, feeling and all that, into some sort of, when I read that poem, that's what, yeah, I understand that, and it means something to me. And this is the search for meaning, how to make meaning out of the knowledge you're having. So it's connecting that knowledge to you, and connecting it in what Heidegger calls an authentic way. Heidegger, I'm sorry to mention his name, but he was a
You
Nazi.
can't really help it, can
No,
you?
he was a Nazi, and can get you into all sorts of nasty little areas. But there is, in other words, we have a subjective view. So um, I'll use one more quote.
Okay.
Kevin Mitchell, Associate Professor of Genetics and Neuroscience at Trinity College Dublin. Even when two people are exposed to what looks objectively like the same environmental circumstances, their subjective experiences may be highly different. And it is the subjective experience that determines whether we learn from something and how it shapes our future behavior. And I think that also encapsulates part of what I'm saying here,
Okay.
that you have to have some sense of, if you're learning about something, you do have a stake in it, which is a personal response to it, whatever it happens to be. Now, this is more relevant in certain subjects than other subjects.
Right. Well, so I mean, there's a neat segue there because I've got a little quotation from your book where you say that a good curriculum takes into account the subjective nature of the teacher, the pupils, and the material being studied. Now, in a practical way, and you've just said this is different in different subjects, but and obviously your specialism is that of a drama teacher. So maybe you could paint us a bit of a picture about what that might look like in a drama lesson. And maybe if you could sort of hint towards, for instance, what that could perhaps look like in science.
Yeah. So it's in terms of drama. Think about going to see a play, and you're trying to say, well, there's kids there all going to see the play, and it's a play probably that's for adults generally. They're seeing Shakespeare or something like that, and they're 15. And some of them are going to say, I like it because they think they ought to like it. Others are going to say, I hate it because they hate it, and
Yeah.
others
Well,
are
we
going
don't know much about it.
and some are
It's
going to
in-
love it. And what, say it again?
Sorry, sometimes we hate things like that because they're alien. We don't know
Yes,
enough about them.
exactly. We have this immediate response to something. And this thing from the wine critic, if you like, is trying to
Mm,
educate our response.
our
So
palate.
what we have to do is say, well, what's tragedy? What's comedy? How do these things work? How does Shakespeare make them work and do these things? And how does this drama work? And give them some way into it. So the grammar of it, if you like, the way into it to understand how it works and to see that. But to say, don't tell me what you think. I'm not interested in what you think at all. What I'm interested in is how you thought it worked. So what worked about it? How did it work? And then take them to another Shakespeare, if you like, and the same thing beforehand, blah, blah, blah. Right. Now let's compare and contrast these things. Which worked better?
Mm,
And which one did you, at this moment, you prefer? So you start bringing in this thing. So you're developing judgments about things. The same thing with novels, with poems, with political discussions, with history. Right? Who's better, Cromwell, Charles? Well, I'm an Irish Catholic, let's say. Right, okay. Well, let's bring your experiences into this as well. And let's widen the perspectives out so we don't just have the two coming in, but these are the perspectives that other people have on these things. With science, well, science, again, it depends what, and again, it depends in
mm,
drama as well, because certain things you teach in drama are fact. That's it. This is what this stage looks like. This is in the round. That's what it
yeah.
means. There are facts and all that. So it depends which science you're talking about. But if we looked at the science education and then put it into the public sphere that people have had over the last few months around the COVID-19 and the way that the governments and scientists, etc., and scientists not agreeing with each other, and the science of uncertainty, and then people who are using different types of science. There's behavioral scientists, there's this type of science. So it's all that. how can you try and deal with something, with uncertainty, with areas of science where science has certain answers which might contradict other answers? How do you know? So how do we get to know things? And I think who talks about this? So Robert and Elizabeth Bjork talk about this, about comparing, contrasting, and they talk about, well, putting a cancerous and a benign sort of
Cell.
cell, well, what lump or whatever it happens to be, together, and trying to differentiate between the two, rather than learning this is what a cancerous cell looks like. Yes, cancerous cell looks like, and then just that, and then move on. You actually put two things together, and by putting the two things together, you learn more about both separately and as they are together. So there's a lot of interleaving, but interleaving together in a very carefully chosen way that you can then bring out the conversation more about things, and people can start to compare and contrast. And some are factual, and some are more opinion, and again depends on the qualities of the subject.
Yes, and that maybe science education should involve a little bit more about acknowledging that science is good at quite good at saying what is the case, but it's very, very bad about saying what ought to be the case, and that's an important distinction to make.
I couldn't possibly comment, but
That's
I
not
mean,
like you, Mark.
perhaps so. But I'm sure there are some science teaching going on there that's very much of that. But of course, there is what I would call the grammar of it, that you need a certain amount of content, which is different, perhaps at different points, to get to that point, to be able to
Right.
be educated in that sense. So you have to know a certain amount, and that varies depending on the topic as well as the subject, in order to get you into the place in order to be able to have that conversation. So it's not about throwing things at kids next to each other saying, look, what's the difference? It's about developing their palate, their appreciation of truth, of beauty, or whatever it happens to be, in order to be able to come to a decision and make a judgment that might disagree with the teacher, but have good reasoning behind it. Now, this comes down to, well, what happens in things like values and all that? How far do you want to push this? And I think that's a very important question, and one I don't necessarily have an answer for, because these things are also, again, in the moment, and decided in schools and all that as well.
Okay, Martin, you've mentioned quite a few times, or a number of times, the idea of grammar. And just in case anyone is thinking that you're talking about parsing sentences and thinking about the subjunctive mood and that sort of thing, you talk about grammar as foundational knowledge for different subject areas. And this is a topic that you explored in great depth in a book that you wrote a number of years ago now called Trivium 21C. And do you want to just talk a little bit about how the ideas that you're talking about educating for wisdom connect to what you've written about previously in the Trivium being a model for making different subjects work in the way that they're presented to students?
Okay, so very quickly, the Trivium has three ways, literally 3 ways, 3 roads, trivia. And those 3 are grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. Dialectic, sometimes known as logos or logic as well, but I use the term dialectic for that, as many have done over time. You can trace it going back, though it's mainly something that came in the medieval curriculum, but it goes right back to the Greeks as well. So we can talk about it till the cows come home, for over hundreds of years if we want to, but let's not. 3 things. Grammar is the foundational knowledge of all things. So the Oxford English Dictionary gives an example, again, funny enough, of wine, and talks about the grammar of wine, and that's, there are other ways that we talk about grammar, but wine has its grammar, football has its grammar, maths has its grammar. Every subject has its grammar. That's its rules, its facts, its way of structuring itself. All those things. So it's the grammar, the foundational knowledge. You need that foundation to build upon, and I think you build from it. Dialectic comes in, and it's the logic of something. You follow the logic through, but it's also the discussion, the debate, the argument, the experiment, the practice, the doing, the making. Putting things together, juxtaposing stuff, all these things. So it becomes a world around that. But if you want to sum it up in one word, thinking. So grammar, knowledge, dialectic, thinking about that knowledge, working with it. And finally, rhetoric, which Zeno called reaching out to the open world. Reaching out to the world with an open hand, but it's communicating. So communicating beautifully and eloquently as well, and persuasively. So those three things I would suggest happen in all subjects. In again, different relationship between the three things. Some have more than one, more than another. But even if you're working, making a pot, for instance, you need to know how to do it technically. Then when you're doing it, you're again involved in the dialectic, you're being involved in the argument with it, the clay itself, and trying to shape it and all that. And then you present it at the end and say, there it is, there's the rhetoric of it. Or doing a play, you learn the script, you do the script, you rehearse it though, work it through, and then present it on stage, you do the playing of it. So those three things happen in most subjects, even if it's just the rhetoric is how to answer an exam question, for example.
Right.
Something. So that's it, three things. And that's kind of it in education, really.
Well, it strikes me, in terms of what you've been talking about the idea of educating for wisdom, educating for freedom, and the idea of metrics getting in the way of that, just sort of tracking sort of progress, that sometimes maybe the element of that that's most perhaps in danger of being lost is the dialectic, the discussion, the grappling to try and integrate new ideas into the way you're thinking. And so, for instance, that one of the things that I quite often get told about is that teachers say, this is the interpretation I want you to have, learn this interpretation, and then go off into your exam and write the answer as learned. And maybe similar to the example you gave about the Frankenstein curriculum, that approach might well equip you to do well in that kind of arena. But what's missing is thinking and meaning, and how do we, in practical ways, what can we do? How do we guard against that maybe arguably most precious element of education being done away with because of expediency?
Well,
what can teachers do in their own classrooms?
Well, that's an interesting point, because when you close the door, you can do what you damn well like to a certain degree. You have amazing freedom. Even you can always change tack when a learning walk ventures into your room. It's like, oh, and this is how to answer this question. Quickly change the slide or move the blackboard on, or whatever it happens to be. I'm very old. But I think it has to be a cultural shift in the school, really.
Yeah.
I think it has to take place at school level, at department level. And that is to, number one, believe that a good education matters more than just the grade, that just the grade isn't necessarily a good education. But a good education can lead to higher grades, can lead to good grades, can lead, to students doing well. So and if they're educated just nth to the, we're going to get this grade, this is how to do it, you've got to use this word to describe this poem, then you will get a really good grade. And doing that from year 7 or year 4 or whatever it happens to be, doesn't lead us to a great place, because we haven't got an educated population. We haven't got people who can actually grapple with what poetry is, how to read poetry, how to think about poetry or plays or art or science. or statistics, to understand statistics, because they've just written in what they have to write in and all that. Though I'm sure with maths, it's a slightly different thing. But I am interested that there's a lot of shall we say, scientific statistical ignorance out there in the world that seem to be coming from our education system. So there is evidence that perhaps we haven't got an educated public as perhaps we want. There is and also, if we look at the internet, we look at the arguments online, are we producing people who can actually see through problems with, I'm taken in by stuff on the internet, you're taken in by stuff on the internet, but a lot of people are are taken in by anything, or are just so blind to listening to different perspectives and appreciating there are different perspectives and empathizing with different perspectives, that I think we need a wider, more variety in what we learn and how we learn about it, and that there might be different views upon things. For instance, when I was a kid, I was learning about the British Empire as a great thing. Now, what it should be is, here's the British Empire, here's colonialism. Let's put them together and look at the perspectives. Let's look at India was one of the richest countries in the world before England, and I call it England, Britain got involved. And I think it went from, I don't know, became something like 5% of GDP at the end of it, or something of 40% to 5%, or whatever. I mean, it reduced so much over that period of time, the riches of that country, because it was being used to make the British Empire better.
Or the British being appropriated,
and therefore putting these things together creates the argument and shows the argument, the dialectic, if you like. And if you're asking which is the best novel, well, you put novels together with other novels to look at it and to have some sort of discussion going on. I use the idea of Heart of Darkness and Things Fall Apart, perhaps, as two novels that can have a conversation together and you can have a conversation about. But in order to get there, we need to know what a novel is.
Yeah, okay.
And kids need to know what these things are and how they fit in, the grammar of what a novel is.
Right. So the three things really important. If we neglect any of those elements, then we'll probably not be providing children with a good education. And okay, so we've got, I'm happy to say, lots of questions that have come in. So I'm going to switch now from my questions to the questions of the participants. And we've got a question here from Manette, and Manette asks, is it important that pupils know the difference between discrete subjects, but also that they're able to make links across subjects? And is this more or less important depending on the age of students? So is it more or less important at primary school or secondary school or later?
It's an excellent question. And I think it's very important they know the differences between subjects. And subjects have a tradition and a history, a way of seeing the world. So it could be the lines are drawn in an arbitrary way, years and centuries ago, but have become more and more important. Just as the lines and borders between countries, some countries which have developed naturally, that is, rather than had them imposed upon them, matter as well, and languages and all these other things that have happened. So yes, it is important that people see. And yes, it's also important to think about what happens across and to see and to be taught explicitly how to look across things as well. I think that's important. Now, I put that with an idea of bringing in a subject called history of thought, which is a way of teaching people about how thoughts can go across subjects, if you like. So the classical world, for instance, how do we know what the classical world looks like? Why has it got columns and statues and all this sort of stuff? And the medieval world looks like this, and various different thoughts come from that. And Christianity is going to give different thought systems, and communism giving different thought ways of seeing the world. So all those things are important. Looking across things is important. The question about where to start, and certainly, again, this would be something of interest, I think, and again, I wouldn't want to say also how to start, because some dancing might start by not looking necessarily like ballet. So you don't necessarily bring in ballet, but you might bring in stuff about dance generally. You might bring in things about drama, might be speaking or doing storytelling or all these other things. Um, bring in languages might start with something like Latin, perhaps, or whatever. But what age you bring them in, I wouldn't venture to comment on that necessarily. But I do think some of this should happen in primary school. So I think after the age of 7 or something like that, um, 8, 9, 10, by the end of primary school, I think people should have a good idea of the different subject areas and that there are different ways of interrogating the world and of the world being presented to you.
Right. Okay. Thanks for that, Martin. Oh, we've got a question here from Claire Stoneman. In fact, we've got a couple of questions from Claire. We might mix them up a little bit. But one of the questions that Claire asks is, how can we help teachers who are working together in different ways to have good quality curricular conversations? And then how do we, and by we, she's saying both teachers and students, become active constructors and reconstructors of knowledge in these conversations?
Yeah, that's a lovely question. Go to the having good conversations takes, number one, time and place. You know, they need somewhere to talk and they need time to talk, and a lot of this can be formal but also informal. You know, the water cooler conversations that are classically thought of or whatever, but in and out of each other's classrooms, a shared space where teachers can meet and talk about things, but also the responsibility. What books are we teaching? Why are we teaching those? What order are we teaching them in? Why are we teaching in that order? But beyond that, why are we teaching those things at all? You know, should we teach novels? Should we teach poems? Should we teach plays? Should we teach photosynthesis? I mean, you know, whatever it happens to be, why are we teaching those things? Why are we teaching it? Is it the wisest thing to do? So Athena gives a direction to that. Is this wise, or is it just for it's in the stock cupboard or it's in the exam and all that? How do we build up the idea of a knowledge-rich curriculum with breadth before they even studied the syllabus at GCSE? What do they need to know at Key Stage 3? What do they need to know at Key Stage 2, Key Stage 1, in order to have a really broad education on which to base further specialization later, perhaps? So if we're going to do Frankenstein, what do we need to know about Frankenstein before we get there? Well, we need to know things about Gothic, about horror, about the Enlightenment, about Romanticism, all those other things that come to it. The novel, how a novel is structured, or a novella. Is it a novella? Is it a novel? Get into that discussion, you know, as well. All those different things as well. So the discussion should be really questioning each other and challenging each other around those things. And senior management perhaps asking, well, have you discussed this? What's your argument for that inclusion of that there? Why is your curriculum having that book there? Oh, we have Blood Brothers because it's good for our kids. That's not a justification. What justification would be is what that novel is bringing, or that play, sorry, is bringing to the kids at that time. What is it really offering them to expand their way of seeing the world and understanding the world in which they're in, to make meaning in it?
One of the questions I found very useful to put to teachers in different schools about their curriculum is saying to them, why are you doing that in term one? What would happen if instead of doing it in term one, you did it in term two? And quite often I've found that the answer is, well, I don't know, we just are. And I think that that's quite a good way in to talk to teachers about the connectedness of their ideas and how they link together, and why you might want to put something before another thing, and how something builds on or responds to another thing. And there's a sort of perhaps as a useful rule of thumb, it's perhaps worth saying to teachers, you should have a reason for
Yeah.
not only what you're doing, but why you're doing it then.
Yeah. and getting the relationship between breadth and depth right. Trying to say not just one damn thing after another, why you're doing something there and then there and then there, but what have you given to students beforehand that puts this into a place? So this
Right.
thing about Frankenstein is what I call the tip of the triangle here. It's right at the tip. This is right. We've got to Frankenstein, but we've done all this beforehand in order to put it into place. How do you get to the poetry of Shakespeare? How do you actually get there? Perhaps you start with a limerick with the idea of a structure to a piece of poetry, or something like that. Then a haiku, then a sonnet, and then right, now we can start near Shakespeare. That's off the top of my head, but
Yeah.
there's some sort of order of something that gets us to somewhere, and the idea that there are things around the T shape, the breadth. There are real things here that we do in a certain amount of depth, and then there are things here that we get our teeth into in order to illustrate something that we've talked about in a broader sense.
Okay, thank you. We've got a number of questions that have come in about the social mobility discussion, and so we're going to return to that a little bit. And Laura says, she says, I don't really understand your point against social mobility. You argued, Margie, we still need people to work in supermarkets, and whilst that's true, isn't the point of social mobility through education that we're giving children an education which enables them to choose different routes if they want to?
Yeah, I'm not saying that you shouldn't have people being judges either. But you don't educate someone to be a judge and someone to be work in a supermarket. They're both having the same education somewhere along, or should be having the same education somewhere along the line, because both of the judge and the person in the supermarket are going to have to do a reading at a funeral one day, let's say. And which poem are they going to choose? Why are they going to choose that? Well, they're both going to have to perhaps get together with thinking about renting or buying a place, and have to understand something about the finances and all those things. They're both going to perhaps have to work out whether they're likely to get COVID, or whatever their risk might be, and trying to work out what sort of life they should lead in order to not get it, or whatever they decide. So it's if you're just saying education is for social mobility, you're saying that there is a meritocracy out there, that people get to the place they're going to be because they've worked hard, or they've worked hard at their education, or they've gone, they've made better choices, or they're better than. Yeah, I think you end up with people in positions of power who think they got there because of their own efforts, and I think that is slightly worrying, because then you start to look at everyone else who didn't get there and thinking, well, I got to here because of my own efforts. They didn't get there, therefore they are lesser people. They don't make the same effort. So education has to be a wider thing than the meritocracy. The meritocracy, I mean, this is Toby Young's dad coming up with this idea, and pointing out all these things that are problematic about it, and saying something along the line, if you've got people in positions of power who think they've got there through their own efforts, you've got a real problem with society. because they do think they got there for a reason.
Right. And this is obviously a live and important debate at the moment about privilege and all of these other things. And it's very.
And you've got to look at, it's not just an individual's efforts. There is,
Yeah.
If you want a meritocracy to work well, you've got to get rid of inherited wealth straight away. You have to make it a real level playing field. You can't have people, you've got to have people living in exactly the same way with exactly the same genetic gifts. You've got to do so many things.
I'm going to stop you there, Martin. Okay. So a slightly different question, but linked. It comes another one from Angelita, who says, so should working class parents and teachers tell their children that if they work hard and study hard, they'll have better career options? Or is this a lie? Isn't this really true? Or isn't that something we should be doing as children progress through education?
I don't think I've understood the question. Try.
So should we say to children in education, if you work hard, you can have a better job, a better life?
I'm saying we shouldn't say it.
Right. Okay.
But I'm not. But I'm also not
because
saying
it's not true, or because it's not
I'm
right.
also saying that if you want to be, it's like going on the X Factor or something like that, and not being, and you can't sing. You've got to be realistic about certain things. If you can sing, it's perhaps saying, well, okay, there are things out there for you and all that. Not everyone is going to be a judge. Not everyone is going
Yeah,
to be a politician, all those things. What we want to do is that you find your way through. So we do want people to be judges, but we're not going to
yeah,
educate everyone to be a judge and to think they only got there through their own way. There are
yeah,
people.
yeah. I mean, I think for me, this is one of the problems around the rhetoric, for instance, of growth mindset, where in some schools the message is, you haven't achieved brilliance yet, so work harder, make more effort, try different things, and the poor old children who are working harder and trying different things and still they're not getting where they want to get. That makes it even more dispiriting, perhaps.
The majority of us don't get to be the top people. I mean, how do you get into the royal family? I mean, you have to marry in, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah, you have to be. Yeah, well, okay, it's a different subject. And then we've got a question here about cultural mobility from Hawk. So Hawke says, is cultural mobility about flexibility in teaching children to adjust their frames of reference, giving them confidence to develop their own judgment and to justify it appropriately, and not being ashamed to make mistakes? That sounds right to me.
Yeah, I'd say it's giving them the knowledge to make their own judgments and the knowledge of differing viewpoints and differing perspectives upon the world, and trying to say that not everything is judged in the same way. And this comes down to how you judge um, education on all things. Trying to say, well, I believe this, but I believe that. But do I have any argument behind it? And
Mm.
do I
Yeah,
have
yeah.
do I know what I'm talking about? And
Justifying that Hawke
yeah,
mentioned. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So judgment is not about being opinionated. It's an educated, and it's a slow process. You have to take time to arrive at a judgment, and that's
Well, you should. Yeah.
that is absolutely key. The different things about different subjects and studying them in their own way is that it allows you to have different perspectives upon the world that meets in the body of one person. So I can one day be the scientist, the biologist, the physics expert, the chemist, and then other times I can be the artist. So I go over the two cultures of arts and science, and I can look at things in different ways and bring things together to help me judge things and to say, well, this is actually more of a scientific question. This is more taste, and this is more about values.
Yeah. We've got a great question here from William, who says, with the popularity of Rosenshine's principles and those kinds of approaches to education, what do you say to those who only promote these research-informed, and he's put that in quotation marks, practices? There are some, he doesn't name any names, but there are some people who'll tell you that you're doing it wrong if you're not doing lots of, for instance, retrieval practice, direct instruction, whatever it happens to be. What would you say to that? I think I know what you'd say, but
Well, but there's an important part. Go back to the grammar thing. That there's an important part of education which is about retrieval practice and knowing your stuff. And a lot of the stuff you need to know can be really enhanced by these methods and regular quizzing, all this other things that become de rigueur. What I'm worried about is it becoming input output. That's the end of it. So it's all about putting things into working memory, long-term memory, trying to get it there and trying to do all that, and a good grade comes out at the end of it. What is then missed in education is a vital part of it, which is the things beyond the rose and shine, if you like, the things about taking the questioning beyond just questioning to try and get something into the long-term memory or all those things, but
it's
actually
the dialectic that we talked about earlier, isn't it?
yeah, the dialectic, the rhetoric must come in as well, and trying to get people to take that knowledge and to do something with it, to think about it, to make judgments. And it's how you wrote an essay, how you should write an essay is to bring knowledge together, create an argument out of it, and then express it beautifully and eloquently and persuasively. And that sort of process is the medieval way, if you like, of putting together a curriculum. I think is vital, or else you do not educate. You just have people who've passed exams, and that is important.
Yes, actually, William actually asks a follow-up question. He points out that some people would say we're failing students if they're not getting the best possible exam results. And I think, so how do we balance the breadth of education and the education for wisdom against the hard practical need to get the best possible results that you can?
I mean, I'm highly pragmatic. I think that kids should get good exam results if they can, and we should educate them to get good exam results. What I would be worried about is that there's a dichotomy between getting good exam results and having a good education, because that would
Right.
suggest there's something very wrong in the
Right.
exam system. And perhaps there is in some cases. Certainly in the past, I found
Right.
myself as a teacher becoming more and more um, driven by senior management towards ways of educating that were meant to get higher exam results, and perhaps took me away from the central purpose of what was getting good exam results in the first place by teaching in this sort of way, more conversational way, but a structured way that focuses as well on the facts, on the knowledge you need to know. We're not saying that is an essential part to it, but going back to the Bjork thing, putting something next to something else and comparing and contrasting enables you to know more about those two things separately as well as together, and that becomes an important thing. But seeing things without the context in which they're in doesn't necessarily help you build your schema, to build an idea about the way things are and how they fit together. And the web of knowledge that Amanda Spielman talks about, all those things are very, very important, and a part of an education building on argument, on expression, and all those things are very much part of that.
So the point maybe that we should take from this is that all of that finding ways of becoming more effective teachers using Rosenshine's principles are important, but there's a risk that maybe we miss out meaning, maybe we miss out the purpose.
We miss out the whole purpose of education if you just do one thing. Yeah,
Okay.
they might pass exams, but do they understand the subject? And later on, do they understand? Perhaps, well, there's always this jump from GCSE to A level that certainly worried some people. Now, perhaps it's more prepared now. I don't necessarily know. And then to university, for example, or to the workplace, or wherever you end up, or being a parent, for God's sake, having to try and do home educating or all these other things. You suddenly realize the gaps in your knowledge. So it is about knowledge acquisition as well. Putting and discussing things is about knowledge acquisition. It's about really cementing it as well. It's not something that's just it's just a bit of flimflammery on the side. It's actually crucial to your relationship to knowledge.
Okay.
It's you, the knower. Do I know my stuff? Can I converse in it? Can I persuade you that I know what I'm talking about here? Especially if I'm bringing in a new viewpoint on something or disagreeing with you.
Okay, so we're 7 minutes past 5. So I hope you're. I know. We've gone a little bit over. We've still got a few questions that we haven't answered. I think we'll just do one more. I'm very sorry for anyone who didn't get their question addressed. And this question is, I think you'll like it because obviously it's from a keen reader who quotes back to you from your own work and points out that you say what makes knowledge rich is how it's organized. So how can we best help school leaders to feel happy with the uncertainties and complexities and the depth of thinking required behind the organization of knowledge?
Yeah. So one of those ways of organizing it is into subject areas.
Yeah.
So if you think of things being completely disorganized, like you're just flooding with bits of stuff coming at you, that's living in the world without any understanding of it. You're just there. So if we took ourselves to a place without tradition, without culture, without all those other things, we are completely ignorant of everything around us. Well, that's knowledge without any structure, without any organization around it. It's by putting things into categories, into subjects, into ways of seeing the world, into this is a road, that's a pavement, this is a house, this is a cat, this is a dog, all these other things. It's giving some structure to the world enables you to see it in the first place, rather than just a lot of, I don't know, when you get into physics, what is it? It's all waves or something like that. Whatever, it's giving some sort of understanding to the world. And a lot of that has come to us through tradition, through the way of seeing the world that has happened before us, and all that. So that gives us structure. The thing is, as well, about that structure, of course, it might also be a place that we don't feel that we fit in, and that becomes the really interesting point about it. Well, yeah, this is, certainly when you're a teenager as well, stuff you, mum, dad, and all that sort of stuff. Well, that was me as a teenager. So you want a way of resisting it and structuring it, ways to say no, ways to see things in a different way, the avant-garde, the anarchic, the dangerous, and all, there are different ways of seeing as well. So this knowledge is organized in different ways against certain things as well, and that enables us to get into that. So yeah, absolutely, the way it's organized helps us find our way. And also, it's not necessarily organized just by the teacher, but the teacher has to be aware that it's organized in different ways around it, and tries to present this to the child in such a way as to give that child a sense of being able to talk about things, or find their place, or find their meaning within that, which again, it's not just in the child, it's also the child within the world.
Okay, Martin Robinson.
I don't know if I answered that. Did I answer it?
Well, I don't know, but you did your best, and that's all we can ask for.
And I thank everyone, because it's been.
Well,
Thank you.
well, before we thank everybody and send them off on a merry way, we do have, thank you very much to Crown House. We do have a couple of copies of Martin's book, Athena and the Machine, to give away. So I'm just going to randomly select from the list of participants 2 people. The first person to come, whose name has come up, is Peter Cook. Well done to you. Well, you've just been there, Peter. You've not done anything special, but well done anyway. And also, the second person who we'll be sending a book to is Lillian Ogunbayi. I hope I'm saying that correctly, Lillian. I'm sure I'm not, but well done, both of you. Those of you that didn't win a copy of the book, if you go to Crown House's website and put in the code CPD30, you will be given a 30% discount. And I can tell you that it's well worth the 70. It certainly isn't worth paying full price for Martin's book, but paying 30% of the price, actually makes it reasonable to invest in. So thanks ever so much, everybody who has tuned in today. We've really enjoyed talking. We've really enjoyed answering your questions, and I'm sorry that we didn't answer all of them. Next Thursday, I'm doing a webinar looking at the problems and limitations of things like growth mindset and resilience and grit and all of those lovely things. So if you're interested in that, that's going to be available next Thursday, usual time, 4:00. But from me, goodbye. From Martin,
Goodbye, and thank you for wonderful questions of your interest. Thank you. Appreciate it.
have a lovely weekend, everybody. See you next week. Bye-bye.